Rejoice, episode 107, Heretics and Whinnynims. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Proteus, chapter 3 of Ulysses. Stephen Dedalus is imagining being in the house of his uncle, Richie Goulding, who he imagines is sitting up in bed, where he does some of his legal and accountancy work. Uncle Richie is whistling an aria from Verdi's Il Trovatore, an opera about a house in decay. Here's the next piece of the text, and it's pretty dense from now on for several paragraphs. No, for several pages. Here we go, here's the quote. Houses of decay, mine, his, and all. You told the Clongowes gentry you had an uncle a judge, and an uncle a general in the army. Come out of them, Stephen. Beauty's not there, nor in the stagnant bay of Marsh's library, where you read the fading prophecies of Joachim Abbas. For whom? The 100-headed rabble of the cathedral close. A hater of his kind ran from them to the wood of madness, his mane foaming in the moon, his eyeballs stars. Whinnynim, horse-nostrilled. Okay, fasten your seatbelts. Those are all Stephen's thoughts, and Joyce had an understandable obsession with his family's fall from grace, from comfortable financial security. John Joyce, the model for Simon Dedalus, Stephen's father, ran them into debt. They moonlight flitted from house to house, one step ahead of the rent collector and the bailiff, and they went into decline. The family in the opera Il Trovatore, from which we had a quote last week, Alata, is also in decline. And Stephen sees his own father as a ne'er-do-well, shiftless individual who has no visible means of support. But he once kept up pretenses. You told the Clongowes gentry you had an uncle a judge, and an uncle a general in the army. Clongowes Wood, was the Jesuit school where Joyce had spent some time, as did one of my own sons, and the Clongowes gentry were the sons of people who were better off than the Joyces, and indeed in a portrait of the artist as a young man, which shows Stephen as a boy in Clongowes school, there's a lot of chatter about boys' fathers being magistrates. Magistrates are kind of local judges. But of course, Joyce himself had to leave Clongowes because his father couldn't pay the fees. And later, in Portrait of the Artist, Stephen lists for a friend his father's attributes. I think I've quoted this before, but it's so good, it's worth hearing again. A medical student, an oarsman, a tenor, an amateur actor, a shouting politician, a small landlord, a small investor, a drinker, a good fellow, a storyteller, somebody's secretary, something in a distillery, a tax gatherer, a bankrupt, and at present, a praiser of his own past. So now, in chapter 3 of Ulysses, Stephen is beginning to assess his own place in the world. And this paragraph, as I say, is all interior monologue. And you have to remember where he is. Despite his own fantasy of visiting his uncle, he's still walking along the broad Sandymount Strand on the coast of the Irish Sea. This is the chapter of Ulysses that once sent me to try and write down my own streamed thoughts, my own stream of consciousness. Have you ever tried it? Don't. I frightened the life out of myself. Well, actually, it's worth trying. It's fun, but you'll never be able to do it. Next piece from this week's text. Come out of them, Stephen. Beauty is not there, nor in the stagnant bay of Marsh's library, where you read the fading prophecies of Joachim Abbas. Well, Stephen did, as he records in the unfinished novel Stephen Hero, he did read Joachim Abbas in Marsh's library in 1902. And by the way, Stephen Hero will soon be the entire subject of one of these podcasts. For whom? Asks the text. The answer? The 100-headed rabble of the cathedral close. The 100-headed rabble of the cathedral close. First, we have some ambiguity here. Or is it mere ambivalence? This is the same Stephen who, a few months earlier, in the closing passages of A Portrait of the Artist as a young man, was putting himself into exile. He's saying it again, come out of them, Stephen. And he's seeking a richer, deeper life experience. Beauty is not there. Which raises the great question, so where is beauty? Joyce, and therefore Stephen, sought everything in the intellect. There's no doubt about that. And yet, is he saying beauty is not in the intellect? That's why I ask about ambiguity and ambivalence. Or is he saying that beauty is not among his people? See, this library thing is interesting. Dublin has the wonderful Marsh's Library, founded by an Episcopalian, that's to say an Anglican archbishop, with a wonderful name, Narcissus Marsh. Stephen reflects on having gone to Marsh's and sat there reading, quote, the fading prophecies of Joachim Abbas. Beautiful, surely, to a mind such as Joyce had? As for stagnant bay, try not to see the word stagnant as negative or prejudiced or derogatory here. In a library, the pools of knowledge haven't been disturbed for many years. In Marsh's, some of them perhaps for centuries. I myself have been to libraries in Europe and Switzerland, where drawers were opened for me, with manuscripts in them that had not been touched since they had been put in there. It's really thrilling. So think of the reading areas as pools, very old pools of scholarship, and I prefer to think of his use of the word stagnant as undisturbed. And by the way, also think of Stagnant Bay and Dublin Bay, where he earlier saw the snot-green sea, the scrotum-tightening sea, and compared it to a pool of his dying mother's green bile. Stephen is, after all, having these thoughts as he walks along the shore. But who was Joachim Abbas, and why would Stephen have been reading him? Remember that there's a kind of sub-theme of heretical inquiry running along here too. In chapter 3, Stephen is testing philosophies and beliefs. We've had Arius the heretic, and now we have Joachim Abbas, who was truly extraordinary, by the way. He was a 13th century monk, a mystic. He was called a heretic by the church because he said that one day, in a vast new theology, the need for the church would disappear. To some, Abbas was a prophet. And here's another Joycean flicker. One of Abbas's major philosophical attempts was to understand and interpret the apocalypse with its four horsemen. And it's now relevant here in Ulysses, because haven't we just earlier had the horses in the sea, and the steeds of the god Mannanan, and some more horse creatures, the Winninams? We'll come to them in a moment. As Stephen asks himself the question, for whom would he be trying to access learning? To whom would he bring the beauty of learning? At this moment, I want to insert a personal note. You can see close up, I hope, why I only have time to do what I call deep basic references in this long adventure we're all on together. I could spend an entire year, and maybe more. People have spent decades on, say, Ulysses and heresy, or animals in Ulysses, or individuation in Ulysses. And why do I say this at this precise moment? Well, I say it because of the phrase, the 100-headed rabble of the Cathedral Close. Here's my explanation. The Cathedral Close was, to put it loosely, the yard of St. Patrick's Cathedral in the Liberties of Dublin, whence have come the two women whom Stephen has imagined into midwives walking along the Strand. But keep your eye on the word rabble. Go for the word rabble. When he was 19, this is really interesting, by the way. When he was 19, Joyce had an article rejected by a Dublin editor. The drift of the piece was a condemnation of the Irish Literary Theatre's preference. The Irish Literary Theatre was fairly new at that time, of its preference for putting on Irish plays instead of international works, specifically a couple of dramas that Joyce had translated from the German. But that, of course, was the Irish Literary Theatre's remit. That's why it was set up. Anyway, Joyce denounced the theatre, which went on to become the famous Abbey Theatre. He denounced it roundly and soundly in a strong piece, The Day of the Rabblement, of which these are the first few sentences. No man, said the Nolan, can be a lover of the true or the good unless he abhors the multitude. And the artist, though he may employ the crowd, is very careful to isolate himself. This radical principle of artistic economy applies especially to a time of crisis. And today, when the highest form of art has been just preserved by desperate sacrifices, it is strange to see the artist making terms with the rabblement. And he goes on to say, the Irish Literary Theatre is the latest movement of protest against the sterility and falsehood of the modern stage. Dumbing down? Is that what he was on about? Here's more. The Irish Literary Theatre, he said, gave out that it was the champion of progress and proclaimed war against commercialism and vulgarity. It had partly made good its word and was expelling the old devil, when, after the first encounter, it surrendered to the popular will. End of quote. You know, I'm glad for Joyce that he never saw reality television and its popularizing of humiliation for profit. So Joyce's objection, I'm sorry if this piece is so complex, it has to be. Joyce's objection was to the power of the rabble. By the way, here comes another heretic. You heard the word Nolan? No man, said the Nolan, can be a lover of the true or the good unless he abhors the multitude. Not some Irish chieftain named Nolan, but the colourful monk and traveller Giordano Bruno of Nola, who was burned at the stake in Rome for heresy, and who, you may remember, I mentioned in Chapter 2, along with Averroes and Maimonides. Ah, Lord, it's so easy to get sidetracked doing this deconstruction. You go down a pathway and you think you can turn back, and then you have to go a little farther because it's so damned interesting. Where was I? Yes. Yes, the Cathedral Close. The Cathedral Close, the 100-headed rabble of the Cathedral Close. The Cathedral Close of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Joyce's time would definitely have seen rabbles from the nearby slums. In fact, a crowd gathered there one day to witness an eclipse of the sun, and the resident of the Cathedral Close, Dean Jonathan Swift, sent them away, telling them that he had postponed the eclipse. And in this next sentence, sure enough, we meet the famous Dean of St. Patrick's, Swift himself. I'll read it again for you. Listen carefully, because it's a wonderful piece. The 100-headed rabble of the Cathedral Close, a hater of his kind, ran from them to the wood of madness, his mane foaming in the moon, his eyeballs stars, Whinanim horse-nostrilled. The hater was, indeed, the Dean of St. Patrick's, Jonathan Swift. They say he went mad, but it wasn't madness. He had a disease that began in his inner ear and made him look crazy. If it was madness that he had, well, I'd like a bit of that myself. Don't you love that description? His mane foaming in the moon, his eyeballs stars. As for Whinanim horse nostrils, the Houyhnhnms were the sentient horses in Swift's great book Gulliver's Travels. It's spelled Houyhnhms. Hell's bells, look at the time. I've outstayed my welcome. This has taken longer than I expected, but I hope I've unraveled some of the complications. More next week. Please join me then. Rejoice, episode 108A. More Dubliners. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Time for another special, another 13th Baker's Dozen episode, How Ulysses Flies By. And, as promised, let's look together at the second 5 stories in Joyce's first published volume of fiction, Dubliners, because they all have some connection to Ulysses, as everything in Joyce's life, everything he wrote, was connected to everything else, and because many letters and emails from those of you who listen to the podcast have asked me the question, what's the best way into Joyce? I think Dubliners is. I dealt with its first 5 stories back in episode 105A, which went up on Bloomsday, the 16th of June. The second 5 stories here are Two Gallants, The Boarding House, A Little Cloud, Counterparts, and Clay. Two Gallants wasn't among the original batch that Joyce submitted to any publisher in 1905. He dreamed up the story and wrote it in January 1906, and in due course acknowledged some inspirational sources for it, one of whom was a real-life policeman's son, the character Corley. At first glance, the story seems to be heading for a simple enough construction. Two young swells, Lenihan and Corley, are swinging their way through Dublin on an August evening. A mild, warm air circulated in the streets. Corley has been talking his head off, and Lenihan has been listening to the monologue. This is a story of moral corruption on a number of levels. The two gallants are speaking of women and girls in a disrespectful way. Lenihan, in his monologue of a recent sexual adventure, refers to that particular girl as a slavey and a tart. Tart was used for more than just prostitute, and a slavey was a kitchen maid. One of the reasons, by the way, that Joyce lampooned Oliver Gogarty in Ulysses by calling him the Buck Mulligan was because Gogarty told people that Joyce had fled to Italy with a slavey, and yes, Nora was a maid in Finn's hotel. The two gallants light cigarettes and talk about how foolish it is to spend money on a date, and soon, amid other derogatory references to other girls on other dates, it becomes clear that Corley has an assignation. Not only that, it also becomes clear that they're in some sort of conspiracy to score something out of this girl, of whom they speak so disgracefully, to take some extra advantage of her. Corley tells Lenihan that the girl is on the turf. That's an old Dublin expression for on the game or being a hooker. Lenihan says to him, "I suppose that's your doing?" And Corley replies, "Oh, there was others at her before me." They walk along Dublin streets. In part, this story is a little travelogue of the city, as it was when Joyce was a student, and then they see the girl. I'm not going to spoil it for you. I'm not going to tell you the ending, which is shocking. Let me just make a few points. 1. The story reeks of seediness and sleaze, without ever doing so overtly. It's just there in the language, especially in the dialogue. And that's point 2. Joyce's ear for the patois of the day among young... It's flawless. The young bucks still spoke like that when, at the age of 18, I came up from the fields of the countryside to work in Dublin, and I recognized this back and forth and this way of speaking about women and girls. It was permanently coarse and relentlessly sexual, and Joyce captures it to perfection. Point 3. Just relish the language. If you ever want an argument against the modern writing dictum of show, don't tell, this story has it. I give you just one sentence. It describes the girl's face. She had broad nostrils, a straggling mouth which lay open in a contented leer, and 2 projecting front teeth. And there's more where that came from. 2 Gallants is one of Joyce's more brilliantly ruthless compositions. The next story, which is number 7 in the actual collection, is called The Boarding House. In one general, overarching respect, it's vintage Joyce, because it contains all at once an entire universe and a continuation. Many of the characters, as happens all through Dubliners, will later surface in Ulysses. The last story, 2 Gallants, was about the sexual deviousness of raw young men. The Boarding House, well, it's about the predatory cunning of 2 women, a mother and daughter. And their actions, Joyce is saying, can actually be called prostitution of sorts, because it's no less than sexual transaction, even if it does take place under a respectable roof. In fact, the mother in the story, Mrs. Mooney, who owns the boarding house, is even referred to as the madam, and the girl, Polly, as the madam's daughter. And that's why you have to be careful here. Don't take that word respectable at face value. Indeed, that's one of the drivers of the story. How respectability and how the notion of a good name is twinned with sexual corruption. It's a seemingly slight tale. Mrs. Mooney has several lodgers. I've been in digs in many such houses. One of them, Mr. Bob Doran, is in his early 30s, and he has a steady job. And he and Polly Mooney have taken a shine to each other. It's difficult for me to progress this much further without giving too much away, so instead I'll concentrate on the details. And I'll begin with one generality that absolutely stunned me, and it's this. When you've been reading this story for a few minutes, ask yourself how smoothly it's slipping down. And the answer will be very. Why is it so smooth? Read it aloud, and you'll discover something riveting. Joyce, the master of prose, the creator when he wished of beautiful, formal language, sounds here like someone who's switching in and out of the style of a storyteller from the oral tradition. It's almost as if he's gossiping the story. Let me give you a few examples of what I mean. This is Jack Mooney, the madam's son. When he met his friends, he always had a good one to tell them. He was also handy with the mitts, meaning that he told jokes and could fight. Another example. It's all very well for the man. He can go his ways as if nothing had happened, having had his moment of pleasure, but the girl has to bear the brunt. And note, too, a couple of details. Here's a really interesting one. Twice, Joyce characterizes Mrs. Mooney by her assured thought of victory in her little enterprise. 2 separate sentences go, she was sure she would win, and she felt sure she would win. She was sure she would win, And then again, she felt sure she would win. He does it twice. Why? Well, who's going to tackle a woman as determined as that? Watch out, too, for the use of spectacles as a prop in the story. And remember that Joyce had to fiddle with spectacles all his life on account of his poor eyesight. Poor eyesight, but what vision. It is, by the way, a chilling story, and it gets all the more chilling when you again encounter the characters in the pages of Ulysses and see what becomes of Mr. Bob Doran. Now we have a story called A Little Cloud. It's one of the longer stories in Dubliners. It was one of the last that Joyce wrote for the collection, and it's a story of which he was extremely proud. And rightly so. It's about one man, Thomas Chandler. Little Chandler is his nickname because he's insignificant. And it's about his view of his life by contrast with that of his successful friend, the swaggering Ignatius Gallagher. Little Chandler is 32. Here's Joyce's description. His hands were white and small. His frame was agile. His voice was quiet, and his manners were refined. He took the greatest care of his fair silken hair and moustache, and used perfume discreetly in his handkerchief. The half-moons of his nails were perfect, and when he smiled you caught a glimpse of a row of childish white teeth. That's what Little Chandler looks like. Little Chandler wants to be a writer. He even wonders if he has the soul of a poet, and he imagines sentences from the great reviews that his books would get. His friend Gallagher is home on a visit from London, where he has become a successful journalist, and he invites Little Chandler to meet him for a drink in a swish place in Dublin, where the waiters, it is said, speak French and German. They drink, and they talk of Paris, and Little Chandler asks wistfully if Paris is as beautiful as they say, and as they lean against the bar, the exotic life of Ignatius Gallagher dominates not only the conversation, but Little Chandler's weary heart and soul. Because, you see, Little Chandler has a wife and child at home, and he knows that he'll never see Paris. In a kind of envious pushback, he assures Gallagher that he, Gallagher, will one day have a wife and be tied down too, but Gallagher tells him that he's in no hurry. "Must get a bit stale, I should think," he said. Little Chandler goes home to his thin-walled house, and a wife in bad temper because he has forgotten a parcel she asked him to collect, and as he sits there, the baby begins to cry. He rocks it, but he can't comfort it. The wailing of the child pierced the drum of his ear. It was useless. He was a prisoner for life. Joyce's observation. There's a seam of autobiography evident in A Little Cloud. Joyce's son and first child, Giorgio, was born the year before he wrote it, and even though his family was powerfully important to him, he was knocked off his feet by this new responsibility. He loved that he had a son. He thought that having a child was one of the most wonderful things that could happen to a man. He said it more than once. Yet he reacted to it by drinking like a fish. And he told his brother that until his son was born, he'd had no fear of fortune. A Little Cloud is a deeply sad story, and it echoes, with a curious reverse, what might have been. Had Joyce stayed in Dublin, was there every chance that he might have become a Little Chandler? And again we have the sublime language. Again we have the picture drawn in a few words. Quote, "Ignatius Gallagher, in the act of drinking, closed one eye expressively over the rim of his glass." Unquote. And again, in the prose, we have the slow, sad music of disappointment. Story number 4 here, number 9 in Dubliners, is named Counterparts. It's the one story that's so painful I almost can't bear it, especially the end. And yet it's the one story that, to my mind, also shows one of Joyce's great directions, his making of the particular into the universal. Also, not a lot happens in anything that Joyce ever wrote, and yet what does happen is major to those to whom it happens. So everything is global, cosmic, huge. And therefore, everything that he wrote teems inwardly. He's alive with underground rivers. The central character in Counterparts is a man named Farrington. Joyce describes him as tall and of great bulk. He had a hanging face, dark wine-coloured, with fair eyebrows and moustache. His eyes bulged forward slightly, and the whites of them were dirty. Close quotes. As we join the story, Farrington's boss, Mr. Alleyne, has sent for him. They work in a legal office, and Mr. Alleyne berates Farrington. Mr. Alleyne is from the north of Ireland. "Why have I always to complain of you? May I ask why you haven't made a copy of that contract between Bodley and Kirwan?" By the way, I should point out here that I'm only making introductions to these stories. There are enough buried references in Dubliners that were to embark upon the exercise of unpacking them, it would take several years, not as many as Ulysses will take perhaps, but it would be no quick hands-dusted job either. Farrington goes back to his desk, angry and gloomy, and soon afterwards he nips out to the pub. He indicates to the chief clerk that he's going to the men's room. The chief clerk checks the hats in the hat rack and is content that they're all present and correct. But Farrington, when he's out of sight, pulls on a cap and goes to a nearby bar. What happens next is, for the times that were in it, predictable for Dublin. What we have here is a bleak story, spread deep into the landscape that Joyce will use for Ulysses. He told his publisher that his intention with Dubliners was to write a chapter in the moral history of his country, in which case, judge his view of his Ireland from this bleak, painful story about a man who has no moral fibre by which he can stand upright. It's in no way a pleasant or redeeming story, but in its telling of a tale from the outside and the inside of a soul at the same time, it's just terrific writing. Time for one more. Number 10 in the volume. The title shifted a few times. Once it was Christmas Eve, then Joyce called it Hallow Eve, and finally Clay. C-L-A-Y. Clay is the story of a slavey, a domestic servant who works in a laundry. Joyce describes her. Maria was a very, very small person indeed, but she had a very long nose and a very long chin. As the story opens, the matron of this laundry, whose name is Dublin by Lamplight, that's the laundry's name, Dublin by Lamplight, has given Maria leave to go out for the evening. It's Halloween. Is that why Maria has a long witch's nose and a long chin? And Maria's chosen treat for Halloween is a visit to Joe Donnelly's house. In an earlier phase of her life, she had been a maid who helped to raise Joe and his brother Alfie. They don't speak to one another now, which Maria regrets. But Joe has a wife who's nice to her, and she loves Joe's children. This is a story full of detail. Her tram journeys, the cake shop, the people she meets, the Halloween games, and the climactic moment when, with Mrs. Donnelly at the piano, Maria sings, "I dreamt that I dwelt in marble halls, with vassals and serfs at my side." Sorry about that. If you're looking for an example of how the young Joyce, he was 23, 24 when he wrote this, of how the young Joyce became the Joyce of Ulysses with all its hidden meanings and symbols, you could do worse than begin with Clay. Oh, I'd love to go to work on it, on the title alone. Maria is an insignificant person, yet everyone commends her. Is she therefore the earth itself, and to be trodden on? Or is it that she is malleable, always being bent to the will of others, like a sculptor's clay or a potter's clay? Or has it to do with the grave, because Halloween, after all, is when the dead are allowed to rise from their graves and walk among us? I could go on, and that's only the title. Read it carefully, read it slowly. Again, I'd say, read it aloud. Read it aloud to yourself, and listen how the words echo. That man could write music in the shortest sentences. So, there you have it, 5 more stories from Dubliners, 2 Gallants, The Boarding House, A Little Cloud, Counterparts and Clay. My next Baker's Dozen will address the final 5 in the collection, including that mighty story, The Dead. And that extra edition will be broadcast here on Friday, the 28th of September. A lot of water will have flowed under a lot of bridges by then, and not least in the River Liffey. As I go through this so enjoyable exercise, I'm thinking that it's no wonder Dubliners was controversial in its day. The stories feel too modern for that era, and sometimes they're shocking, and they're often almost unendurably authentic. Joyce's Aunt Josephine refused to read Ulysses. She said that by all accounts it wasn't fit to read. When he heard it, he had a great response. If Ulysses isn't fit to read, he said, then life isn't fit to live. Well, Aunt Josephine probably didn't read Dubliners either. Rejoice, episode 108, Bald Heads and Lantern Jaws. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Last week we had heretics and Houyhnhnms, and once again I'm going to pick up where I left off. I'll kick it into life with a short overlap. Here's the last bit from last week's text. A hater of his kind ran from them to the wood of madness, his mane foaming in the moon, his eyeballs stars. Houyhnhnm, horse-nostrilled. End of quote. And if you were with me then, you'll know that I was, or rather Joyce was, referring to Jonathan Swift, the 18th century Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, who allegedly went mad and who in his great and famous book Gulliver's Travels had fabulously intelligent horse creatures called Houyhnhnms. So now you know. Now read on. Here's the second half of that paragraph that I began last week. Stephen's thoughts again on Sandymount Strand. Quote, he's thinking, remember, the oval equine faces, Temple, Buckmulligan, Foxy Campbell, Lantern Jaws, Abbas father, furious Dean, what offence laid fire to their brains? Paf! Descende calve, ut ne amplius de calvaris. A garland of grey hair on his comminated head, see him, me, clambering down to the footpace. Descende, clutching a monstrance, basilisk-eyed. Get down, bald pole. End of quote. And again, please remember, this paragraph, like all of Joyce's paragraphs, most of his sentences, and many of his words, they are but facades for a wealth and welter of reference and meaning that lies behind them. My job is to bring those goods out into the light from the back of the shop and show them to you where possible. And so far we've managed, I think, to pick up most of his meanings. Once again, though, and I have to say this because of your emails and letters, let me explain a difficulty that I have. Sometimes I could spend more than 1 week's broadcast on a single word, and sometimes the goods on display can take us away down many a glittering path. But that's part of the fun, for me at any rate. And if ever proof were needed of what I was saying a few moments ago about the density of Joyce's references, well, here we go. The opening sentence again of this week's text. And now, what I'm really saying is, now you're beginning to know, I think, or you should anyway, why the whole thing takes so long. Okay, text. The oval equine faces. The oval equine faces. Shaped like eggs. Looking like horses. And then he gives the names Temple, Buckmulligan, Foxy Campbell, Lantern Jaws. What is Joyce on about here? What is Stephen's thinking? And how did he get to those thoughts? Well, he got to the equine faces through Swift's horse Houyhnhnms, obviously. He's already, in chapter 1, describing Buckmulligan as having a shaking, gurgling face, equine in its length. Do you remember that? On top of the Martello Tower? So who are the others? Temple, he names Temple. He's based on a man named John Elwood, a medical student of Joyce's acquaintance. Temple had dark oval eyes, dark gypsy eyes. He's in Portrait of the Artist quite a bit, where he's a noisy and troublesome fellow who loves scornful gossip and controversy. Buckmulligan, well, you've already met him. Foxy Campbell, Lantern Jaws, they're one and the same person. And again we're reminded that the Stephen Dedalus of Ulysses is only 3 months older than the Stephen Dedalus in A Portrait of the Artist as a young man. Foxy and Lantern Jaws were the two nicknames for Father Richard Campbell, one of the Jesuits at Belvedere College when Joyce went to school there. Father Campbell is in A Portrait of the Artist too. Forgive me for this digression, but it's worth bringing you the part where Stephen is wondering whether he too might become a priest. The Reverend Stephen Dedalus, S.J., he thinks, and goes on to think, quote, this is from Portrait, his name in that new life leapt into characters before his eyes, and to it there followed a mental sensation of an undefined face or colour of a face. The colour faded and became strong, like a changing glow of pallid brick red. Was it the raw, reddish glow he had so often seen on wintry mornings on the shaven gills of the priests? The face was eyeless and sour-favoured and devout, shot with pink tinges of suffocated anger. Was it not a mental spectre of the face of one of the Jesuits, whom some of the boys called Lantern Jaws, and the others Foxy Campbell? End of quote. Not the most flattering portrait, is it? Anyway. Right, brace yourself. Here's the next bit of this week's text. Quote, Abbas' father, furious Dean, what offence laid fire to their brains? Paf! Descende calve, utne amplius de calvaris. Well, here's the breakdown of that. The furious Dean is Jonathan Swift, and Abbas is Joachim Abbas. Remember him from a few weeks back, the Italian 12th century mystic? And there's a further and deeper literary connection here to a short story written by the poet W.B. Yeats, a short story called The Tables of the Law. It's surprisingly gripping, and in it, the first-person narrator is having a discussion with one Owen Ahern, with whom the narrator had been a student. And this Owen Ahern, note the omega and the alpha, the O and the A. This Owen Ahern, in the midst of a very personal discussion, suddenly grabs a candle from the table and leads the narrator along corridors to his private chapel to show him there a long-lost and immensely secret book by Joachim Abbas. That's how Stephen comes to ask what made Joachim Abbas and Jonathan Swift so other, so departing from their surrounding norms. And here's his expansion of the thought. Paf. Paf is just an expletive like pie, a sound of contempt. Descende calve utne amplius de calvaris. I'm stopping myself. Hang on. We know the person we have here, don't we? James A. Joyce. It's Paf that's stopping me, and he would have been familiar with a poem by the great Victorian poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, a poem called The Golden Legend, apocalyptic in its own way, and about as weird a piece as ever was. One of the main narrators is Lucifer, and here are the relevant lines. They come not far from the end. Quote, Of a truth, it often provokes me to laugh, to see these beggars hobble along, lamed and maimed and fed upon chaff, chanting their wonderful piff and paff. Satan is describing a bunch of pilgrim friars. So you can see we're in the same territory. Friars, pilgrim friars. Abbas is a friar. And the contempt, Satan's contempt, continues with a remark wrongly attributed to Joachim Abbas, who was much too kind by all accounts ever to say, Descende calve, utne amplius de calvaris. Come down, you bald man, or you might get balder. That quote does, however, come from the secret book that Abbas is supposed to have written. It's Vaticenia, or Vaticania, I think it should be. It's often misprinted as Vaticenia. I think it's a misprint. Vaticania Pontificum, the very same secret book that Yeats's narrator is being shown by the fellow Owen Ahern. Allegedly, you see, here's the story behind it. Abbas bowdlerized a moment in the Bible. I say allegedly, I'll come to that in a moment too, where a bunch of children mock Elisha. Over the centuries, it became clear that Abbas didn't write it. And what seems to have happened was very common, is that those who wanted to blacken Abbas as a heretic wrote this book under his name and included stuff in it, distortions, forgeries, all manner of material unwelcome to the Catholic Church. It wasn't an uncommon method of destroying someone. Interesting, isn't it, that Stephen is having these thoughts and memories of his own reading Abbas as he's walking along Sandybound Strand and teasing out his own beliefs. He's reaching for a great thinker who was wronged, as he himself fears being wronged by Buck Mulligan. Next we have, I quote, a garland of grey hair on his comminated head, see him, me, clambering now to the footpace, descende, clutching a monstrance, basilisk eyed. Get down, bald pole. Well, this is more of the same. To comminate somebody, minat, M-I-N-A-T, is at the center of that word, comminate. It comes from the same root as minatory, meaning warning. To comminate somebody is to denounce them as a heretic, to threaten them with God's vengeance. This, therefore, what we've just had here, is a blurt from Stephen's mind. The crucial moment here is the three words, see him, me. Abbas and Stephen as a priest merging persecuted people. The monstrance, by the way, that's a powerful image. The monstrance is that wonderful, whatever your beliefs, that wonderful gold sacred vessel, often built like a starburst on a stem of silver, and at its heart glows the host, the Eucharistic host, in a little disc of glass. Here's the explanation. the footpace, clambering down to the footpace. That's the step just before the heights of the altar. It's also called a predella. And at certain devotions, the monstrance with the host is on display high above the altar. So he's describing a priest, I've seen it so many times as a child, he's describing a priest with a tonsured head of grey hair, having reached up and taken down the monstrance. And then the priest turns round to bless the congregation with the monstrance. Now, let's home in on the word basilisk. The priest is basilisk or basilisk-eyed. This is one of the many reasons Joyce has been accused of quite extreme blasphemy. The basilisk is a mythical beast, serpentine in part. He's in a lot of English heraldry, and he has magical powers, and they're not all benign. A basilisk look is a withering look. The basilisk could wither you. So here is Stephen, unconsciously comparing the white disk of the Eucharistic host at the heart of the monstrance to an evil eye, or at the very least saying that the priest wielding the monstrance in blessing has an evil eye. And he follows it up with a contemptuous and dismissive thought. Get down, bald pole. And Joyce well knew that the tonsured hairstyle in the men of the Catholic Church was intended, in friars, for example, was intended to echo Christ's crown of thorns. Well, well, more next week. Rejoice, episode 109, Menace and Echo. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We're still on Sandymount Strand with Stephen Dedalus in Chapter 3 of Ulysses, and if you recall last week, we were in the throes of heresy and contempt, and a dash of blasphemy. Stephen, you see, has envisaged a priest with tonsured grey hair, cut in a circle, that is, around his baldness, giving a blessing from a monstrance. Now, Joyce turns it into showbiz. Here's this week's first quote. A choir gives back menace and echo, these are Stephen's thoughts, assisting about the altar's horns, the snorted Latin of jack priests, moving burly in their albs, tonsured and oiled and gelded, fat with the fat of kidneys of wheat. That's the end of that sentence. And what a vivid sentence it is. So let me unpack it. I've said, as everybody who knows anything about Ulysses knows it's true, I've said how much this novel is stretched over the frame of Homer's Odyssey. What I might not have emphasized sufficiently is how many references it has to the Bible and other Catholic texts. There's no doubt that James Joyce flirted with being a Jesuit. Who can blame him? That classy austerity, that engine of collected learning and intellect. But although I know all this, why am I surprised at how often Ulysses is biblical? Maybe I'll know in 28 years or so when I've done with this. So here we go with the unpacking. A choir gives back menace and echo. I love this. Think of two limbs of organized religion. One is fear, the fear that living a bad life will result in eternal damnation. That was the Catholicism that Joyce learned. Menace and echo, as to echo, well, how did prayer happen? By echoing the priest's intonations. And they may have been called prayers, but a prayer is a statement of worship as prescribed by a church. Joyce, as we all were, was taught prayer by rote, by repeating everything the priest said, by echoing him through what the priest was saying. The faithful echoed what the church was teaching. And yes, this is the kind of stuff that got Joyce into trouble. Menace and echo. Next phrase, assisting about the altar's horns, biblical again. In the Bible, the horns of the altar are mentioned more than once. The horns of the altar. In the book of Revelations, for instance. And I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God. And the horns of the altar, a crucial part of worship, are in Exodus, Leviticus, Daniel. There were actual horns, one fixed at each corner of an altar, smeared with blood for atonement, and as I heard it in school, the sacrificial lamb was tied wrist and ankle, so to speak, to each corner before slaughter. And in Stephen's thoughts, in Stephen's flowing thoughts, who is assisting about the altar's horns? He hears the snorted Latin of jack priests moving burly in their albs. This is definitely derogatory. The alb is the loose white garment of a priest, alb as in albus, always white. It's one of the fundamental robes of the Mass, for instance. And burly in their albs is one of those brilliant Joycean visual moments when we see the image rather than merely read it. And a jack priest, that's a fake priest. And this I love because there's an entire linguistic mini subculture springing from the word jack. Jack priest comes from jack gentleman, and a jack gentleman was a parvenu, an upstart, a nouveau riche, who was born poor but who jacked himself up through the heights of society. And I feel free here to think that Joyce was mocking the difference between priests whom he saw as having genuine vocations to a devout life and those who only pretended because priesthood was a good gig, as it was in those days. So we're definitely derogatory here. Listen again to Stephen's thought. Jack priests moving burly in their albs. And then he goes on, tonsured and oiled and gelded, fat with the fat of kidneys of wheat. Tonsured is the crown of thorns haircut we talked about last week. It's in every cartoon of a monk ever drawn. Oiled and gelded. Celibate priests, therefore, gelded in practice, if not in actual physicality. Oiled suggests the sleekness of the traditional view of well-fed clergy, which is one of the most common dismissals of priests. And fat with the fat kidneys of wheat? Well, that's a straight lift from the Bible. That's from Deuteronomy. Butter of kine and milk of sheep, with fat of lambs and rams of the breed of Bashan, and goats with the fat of kidneys of wheat, and thou didst drink the poor blood of the grape. And if you read on, you'll see the depth of the insult in Stephen's mind. Or is it an insult to the church? Here's a quote from the Bible. But Jeshurun waxed fat and kicked. Thou art waxen fat, thou art grown thick, thou art covered with fatness. Not necessarily clergy. I'm thinking again of plump Buck Mulligan, by whom Stephen feels persecuted. Next passage of text in Ulysses, I'll read it for you. And at the same instant, perhaps a priest round the corner is elevating it. Dring, dring! And 2 streets off, another is locking it into a pyx. Dring-a-dring! And in a lady chapel, another taking hazel all to his own cheek. Dring-dring! Down, up, forward, back. And that's the end of quotations for this week. And once again, I urge you, don't just read this. See it. Because we are looking at something quite specific. We're looking at something I saw 100 times as a child, the elevation of the host in what were called evening devotions. Stephen thinks first, and at the same instant perhaps a priest round the corner is elevating it. Dring, dring! This is a comment on the universality and the uniformity of Catholic worship. As one priest is doing something in one place, other priests are in multiple places doing the exact same. So, in a church, on the altar, a priest has the monstrance, the display sacred vessel. The host of the Eucharist has been placed in the clear glass compartment at the center of the monstrance like a great white eye. And the priest has raised the monstrance to bless the congregation. And the altar boy rings his little hand bell. Mine had 4 bells on it, one at each brass corner. And here we have one of the many, many onomatopoeic examples that abound all over Joyce, literature as music. Dring, dring, we rang it 3 times. Next sentence, and 2 streets off, another locking it into a pyx. Dring-a-dring, same thing. The elevation is over, and the priest is putting away the host, the round, white, circular, sacred, Eucharistic wafer. He's locking it in a pyx in a church a couple of streets away. A pyx, P-Y-X, is a sacred vessel reserved exclusively for the consecrated host, the most sacred object in all Catholic worship. And a pyx is usually made of silver or gold. Only an ordained priest was supposed to handle it, I think, though maybe a sacristan could, or a deacon. And the word pyx comes from a Greek word, puxis, a box. And as the priest puts it away, the altar boy rings his bell again, back at the elevation of the monstrance in a different church. And as the third example, in a lady chapel somewhere, a priest celebrating Mass alone takes hazel alone. Housel's a word for Eucharist. It's a Norwegian word, actually. It means sacrifice. And back at the elevation, the altar boy rings a third time in this trinity of remembered celebrations. I expect you know what a lady chapel is. No, it's not a side chapel reserved for women. It's a side chapel east of the high altar, usually in cathedrals or basilicas, dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of Christ, known universally to Catholics as Our Lady, which, by the way, is why the word bloody used to be seen as a terrible curse word because it was a telescoping of by Our Lady. And after the priest taking communion alone, we have the 4 words from Joyce in Stephen's Thoughts: down, up, forward, back. A curious selection of directions, since the movement of the monstrance is up, down, right, and left, after the sign of the cross. But as ever, Joyce has his reasons, and we'll address them next week. Rejoice, episode 111, Naked Women. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We've just been through a complicated passage of Stephen's interior monologue. He's walking on Sandymount Strand. He has been imagining visiting his Uncle Richie nearby, and he has been dwelling on the decline of his family. And this led him to a consideration of how he might break away from them. And he moots that not even in the quiet corners of a beautiful old library can he escape and find the beauty that he needs and wants. The library thought reminds him of the medieval friar Joachim Abbas, whose works he was reading, and this further leads him into a consideration of the Catholic religion and its cornerstones and the bells he rang in the church as an altar boy. Now he has a new, sharper set of thoughts, more direct, more of life, less ethereal. And here are those thoughts. They're quite famous. Here's the quote. Cousin Stephen, you will never be a saint. Isle of Saints, you were awfully holy, weren't you? You prayed to the Blessed Virgin that you might not have a red nose. You prayed to the devil in Serpentine Avenue that the fubsy widow in front might lift her clothes still more from the wet street. Oh, si, certo. Sell your soul for that? Do dyed rags pinned round a squaw? More, tell me, more still. On the top of the Hoath tram, alone, crying to the rain, naked women, naked women! What about that, eh? What about what? What else were they invented for? End of quote. Okay, some of it is straightforward, such as, Cousin Stephen, you will never be a saint. Isle of Saints. Well, maybe not so straightforward. This is a bowdlerization of Dr. Samuel Johnson, who quotes a remark from John Dryden. To whom did Dryden make the remark? Well, here's a clue. We've recently been hearing about the man and his alleged madness, and that's why he's still in Stephen's thoughts. Dryden said, Cousin Swift, you will never be a saint. Jonathan Swift, author of Gulliver's Travels and Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, was thus addressed. I had a look at it. Here's what actually happened. It had more to do with poetry than devoutness. Swift, as a young man, aspired to be a poet, and he wrote a series of odes which he circulated. And here's how Johnson tells what happened next. I have been told that Dryden, having perused these verses, said, Cousin Swift, you will never be a poet. That's a put down. And yet, in his wonderful book, Lives of the English Poets, Dr. Johnson hails Dryden. Here's a quote. Perhaps no nation ever produced a writer that enriched his language with such a variety of models. And he then used an old Latin tag to describe Dryden's effect on English poetry. Here's the translation. He found it brick and left it marble. And by the way, if you want to read English where every word is perfectly placed for maximum meaning and intent, read Dr. Johnson's Lives of the English Poets. I have the book here beside me. It's a book that I love. Right, next sentence in Ulysses harks back to Stephen's self-professed devoutness as a young schoolboy. You were awfully holy, weren't you? You prayed to the Blessed Virgin that you might not have a red nose. Again, Joyce's reductio ad absurdum. that he so often employs when religion rears its head. He just wants to make a nonsense of his Catholicism and of prayer in general. That's, of course, what roasted him in the eyes of the Irish. My mother used to call him that old blasphemer. Yes, you prayed to the Blessed Virgin that you might not have a red nose. I mean, that's not something worth praying for, is it? Oh, hang on, I jumped over Isle of Saints. You probably know it. In its golden monastic era, Ireland was known as the Island of Saints, Insula Sanctorum, or the Island of Saints and Scholars, or in Joyce's own Italian phrase, Isola de Santi e dei Salvi. Isola dei Santi e dei Salvi, the Island of Saints and Sages. He actually gave a lecture on this topic in Trieste on Sunday, April the 14th, 1907. He was 25, lecturing in Italian and in full flow at 25. And here's what he said about Ireland, about the Island of Saints and Sages. The soul of the country, he said, is weakened by centuries of useless struggle and broken treaties. That was his declaration. And he went on, while its body is manacled by the police, the tax office and the garrison, nobody who has any self-respect stays in Ireland but flees afar. And he wondered why they didn't like him back home. Next line of Ulysses' text. Where are we? Yes. You prayed to the devil in Serpentine Avenue that the fubsy widow in front might lift her clothes still more from the wet street. Oh, sì, certo. Look at the blasphemous swing of the man. On the one hand, the most revered figure after God, Mary, the mother of Christ, and he prays to her for a trivial reason, that he won't have a red nose. And on the other hand, he then prays to the devil for a lewd opportunity. That happened, he recalls, on an avenue not far from where he's walking. Serpentine Avenue runs, I feel sure, I hope my memory's accurate, from Ballsbridge to Sandymount, and of course he's on Sandymount Strand. By the way, I love fubsy. It means that she was a short, plump widow, but he somehow seems to use it as though she were also dowdy, fubsy widow. And oh sì, certo. Well, you can guess that in Italian that means certainly, but there's a subtle little extra linguistic emphasis here, because Joyce put a comma between sì and certo. Now, if he hadn't, it would have meant just certainly. But the fact that he has a comma means that he's saying in his head, oh yes, certainly. In other words, with the yes, certainly, Stephen is emphasizing, stressing, pushing his own baseness. So this is a self-critical passage. Actually, this gets worse. Next line, get this. Sell your soul for that, do. Dyed rags pinned round a squaw. Mr. Joyce, this is not good. This is actually rather bad. And he knows it. Here we have the Stephen from A Portrait of the Artist as a young man engaged in tentative sexual adventure, but with a base attitude that was more than inappropriately informed by an adolescent boy's sexist and coarse view of women. Sell your soul for that, do. Dyed rags pinned round a squaw. The adventurer, the explorer, strides into camp and selects a woman in a teepee or an igloo. Squaw was not quite as impolite a coarse synonym as you could get for the word woman in Joyce's time, but it was pretty bad. And the word rag, well, that came into the patois of his Dublin friends, because a girl wasn't sexually available during her period, in their view, and in society's view. And given the primitiveness of facilities available to women and girls, no tampons in those days, they used all kinds of emergency procedures, and so a girl was said to be on the rag when she had a period. I think it might still be in use as a phrase. In fact, I actually remember hearing it not that long ago. Now, think now of the imagery. Dyed rags, i.e. rags that have colour to them, tied round a squaw. That's a pretty low thought of Stephen's, isn't it? And slightly cowardly of Joyce to make it so unavailable as an image. He didn't spell out that Stephen's mind was flitting across the subject of menstruation. Stephen goes on reminding himself of his own baseness as he sees it. More, tell me, more still. On the top of the Hoath tram, alone crying to the rain, naked women, what about that, eh? What about that? What else were they invented for? Can't you just hear the student coarseness in that? And he says alone, but can't you imagine a bunch of students, university students, who knew nothing about women? And can't you imagine the young male sexist ignorance? What else were they invented for? Nora Barnacle, Joyce's lifelong partner and eventual wife, said, Jim knows nothing at all about women, so he may not have changed that much. And here, through Joyce, Stephen exhibits the worst kind of sexism, and then, this is so Irish, this is so Catholic, and then tortures himself with his own self-reproof. Yeah, not the most savoury passage this week. More next week. Rejoice, episode 112, Epiphany Time. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney, and we're still deep in Stephen Dedalus' thoughts as we reach about 1/3 of the way into chapter 3 of Ulysses. Here's this week's chunk of text, and there are complications. Nothing new there, I hear you cry. Stephen's been reproving himself somewhat for base carnal thoughts, or at least he's been recalling them in a way that's unflattering to himself. On we go with the self-remembering and the self-disapproval. Here's the quote. Reading 2 pages apiece of 7 books every night, eh? I was young. You bowed to yourself in the mirror, stepping forward to applause earnestly, striking face. Hooray for the goddamned idiot, hooray! No one saw, tell no one. Books you were going to write with letters for titles. Have you read his F? Oh, yes, but I prefer Q. Yes, but W is wonderful. Oh, yes, W. Remember your epiphanies, written on green oval leaves, deeply deep, copies to be sent if you died to all the great libraries of the world, including Alexandria? There you are. It's not the entire paragraph, but I'm anxious not to try and put a quart into a pint pot. I'll finish the paragraph next week. We're still in Stephen's thoughts, so we start with a glimpse of what Joyce's own reading life must have been like. And everyone years ago accepted that Stephen is more or less, and more than less, the young James Joyce. Reading 2 pages apiece of 7 books every night, eh? 14 pages of text a night, and with such poor eyesight. But we know that Joyce's reading was vast and prolific and wide-ranging. In fact, I'm surprised that it was only 14 pages a night. It has to have been much more. His brother Stanislaus remarked that when Jim found an author that he liked, he didn't stop until he had read everything that author had written. He read very fast, and he read far outside the typical range of a schoolboy or student of the time or of his acquaintance. And here, in this week's piece of text, there's an interesting little squib of insight into Joyce's view of reading. Listen, Stephen's thought. You bowed to yourself in the mirror, stepping forward to applause earnestly, striking face. Hooray for the goddamned idiot, hooray! No one saw, tell no one. Did he see reading, to judge from this, as a performance, a private performance, as writing is? There's many an actor who has recounted the experience of going to the mirror as a child, if reproved, to watch their own tears. Joyce stepped up to take a bow after his chunk of reading with his striking face. Incidentally, here's a tiny, minuscule moment where Joyce stops you dead. It's tiny, as I say, but it's worth highlighting. In the lines, hooray for the goddamned idiot, hooray, he spells hooray, as you'd expect, Hurray. And then, second time he uses the sound, then comes the far more effective ray, Hray, or hooray. Love it. 3 cheers, hip hip, hooray. And no one saw him, and he was going to tell no one about this performance. I find this an enormously interesting glimpse into Joyce's writing attitude. There's no doubt to my mind that it had an element of performance in it. He watched himself do it, and went to the mirror to see whether what he had read had left an imprint on his face, i.e. his spirit. And at least once in Ulysses, and very tellingly, a mirror plays a part, and we will get to the specific moment I mean in or around the year 2031, 2032. Now we have a famous moment, or should I say a moment that Joyce made famous. Stephen recalls an earlier literary ambition. Books you were going to write with letters for titles. Have you read his F? Oh yes, but I prefer Q. Yes, but W is wonderful. Oh yes, W. And we add to that, because we should, the next line, and this is important. Remember your epiphanies, written on green oval leaves, deeply deep, copies to be sent if you died, to all the great libraries of the world, including Alexandria. Keyword there? Epiphanies. Huh. I have here beside me a copy of Stephen Hero, the not short novel that Joyce didn't publish. And it's crucial to understanding what I've just read aloud from Ulysses. We know that the Catholic Church has a feast of the Epiphany. That's the 6th of January, Little Christmas, Women's Christmas. It's an ancient feast. It marks the day in which the Magi, or the Magi, the three wise men, the three kings of Orient, Caspar, Balthazar, and Melchior, came to Bethlehem to view and pay homage to the newborn Christ, and they brought him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Shakespeare would later parody the image of three distinguished foreign gentlemen in his play, The Merchant of Venice. Remember, they come as suitors for Portia? Well, Joyce, were they all foreign? Well, the Duke of Morocco was. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Joyce had a different view of the word epiphany. He went to the original root of the word, and he kind of capitalized on it. It comes, you won't be surprised, from the Greek, where phaneis means to appear. And in classical religious circles, an epiphany is a moment of revelation when the deity reveals himself or herself to the worshipper. Well, Joyce turned this into a literary occurrence. And thanks to him, I've always thought that an epiphany is a moment of sudden revelation with some deep meaning, a kind of sudden, blinding flash of insight, so vivid that the gods might have FedExed it to the recipient. And I think, this is a digression, I know, but forgive me, but I think it's worth looking at where he launched his epiphanies in Stephen Hero. And here's the exact quote. I'm reading it from the book. Claritas, says Stephen, is quidditas. He goes on, after the analysis, which discovers the second quality, that's quidditas, the mind makes the only possible logical synthesis and discovers the third quality. This is the moment which I call epiphany. First, we recognize that the object is one integral thing. Then we recognize, I love this, then we recognize that it is an organized composite structure, a thing in fact. Finally, when the relation of the parts is exquisite, when the parts are adjusted to the special point, we recognize that it is that thing which it is. Its soul, its whatness, leaps to us from the vestment of its appearance, the soul of the commonest object, the structure of which is so adjusted, seems to us radiant. The soul achieves its epiphany. Do you get all that? Actually, you will. Let it sink in. Let it just seep in. The key word there is quidditas. In English, quiddity. And it means the real nature or essence of a thing. I remember a joke program on the BBC called The Isness of Is. But quiddity is that which makes a thing what it is. And Joyce is flexing here the muscles that he will later begin to use in a much more refined way in Chapter 3 of Ulysses, the chapter we're on now. In Stephen Hero, he was flexing his muscles when he discusses the nature of things according to their visibility and indeed their audibility. So observe how here he's hanging the whole thing together by introducing us to the word epiphany. Is Stephen Hero being pretentious? Actually, it is. Yes, he is. And no, he's not, because to judge from the writing and how often he comes back to these philosophical points, Joyce was genuinely interested in deep and subtle philosophical points. And yes, he did have the pretensions of all young men, but damn it, he was brilliant. Oh, and by the way, Harry Potter fans, I'd like to linger over the word Quidditch. So back to Ulysses and Stephen, quote, Remember your epiphanies written on green oval leaves, deeply deep, copies to be sent if you died to all the great libraries of the world, including Alexandria. Even though the Library of Alexandria had long and infamously been destroyed, how many people, myself included, would love to have seen it? But the remark is interesting as Stephen thinks it, because it shows how Joyce valued his own work while mocking himself at the same time. And that twinning of genuine praise and appreciation alongside deprecation, and so immediately after a profound and significant moment, the Epiphany, that seriousness and mockery, that building up and taking down all at once, that's so Dublin, it's so Irish, and it runs all through Ulysses like a trumpet note throughout a music score. Back next week, and I'll finish the paragraph next week. Oh, wait a minute before you go. I hate to leave you with that somewhat convoluted philosophical definition of epiphany. It really means that moment when something brilliant manifests itself. It can be a god, or a sudden idea, or a wonderful flash of insight. And who knows, one day, with the help of the gods and a fair following wind, an epiphany might even be a podcast. See you next week.